Good evening and welcome to Glasgow and to the third and last of these question time programmes in which spokesmen of the political parties are meeting the lady and gentlemen of the press. The party spokesmen in Glasgow are the Right Honourable William Ross, Labour, by profession a school teacher, but for 20 years a Member of Parliament, educated in Glasgow University and with the HLI in South East Asia, for the last 17 months Secretary of State for Scotland. The Right Honourable Michael Noble, Conservative, by profession a farmer, Chairman of the Unionist Party in 1962 and from 1962 to 64 Secretary of State for Scotland. Russell Johnson, Liberal, by profession a school teacher, educated at Edinburgh University, from 1961 a member of the Scottish Liberal Party Executive and now Vice Chairman of the Scottish Liberal Party. John Gare, Scottish National Party, by profession, again, a school teacher, educated at Edinburgh University, a member of the Executive Committee and of the National Council of the Scottish National Party. James REID, Communist Party, by trade an engineer, former National Secretary of the Young Communist League, Secretary of the Scottish Communist Party. And welcome, gentlemen. Facing you, I trust, an inquisitive but polite lady and gentlemen of the press. Can I call then for the first question from Charles Graham of the Scottish Daily Express?
Mr. Chairman, some time ago, in most unpleasant circumstances, British politics and politicians were shaken by the slogan, "It is a moral issue." Does any spokesman here tonight believe that politics in general, and voting in particular, is indeed a matter of moral choice, and that his party deserves to be elected because of its superior moral virtues? Or is it really true, Mr. Chairman, as is popularly supposed, that in politics expediency is far more important than principle?
Is expediency more important than principle in politics? Willie Ross.
No, it must never be, or politics would really be a sham and a humbug. I think principle inevitably is important. I think moral principles are important, and I think a government that would desert our moral standards or take action that would lead to a reduction of our moral standards is not worthy of support at all. This applies to action. It applies to decisions to take action in relation to circumstances where you might not be popular. I think governments must give a lead. I think we see this in relation to events at home, in matters that affect our social behaviour. I think the government must weigh up just exactly how any particular piece of legislation would lead to a lowering of standards, or seem to be encouraging a lowering of standards. It applies also in the international field. Now, we've had issues time and time again. In fact, I've used this phrase of moral issues in relation to Rhodesia at the present time. We can't shirk these issues, and we've got to take action, and governments must declare their principles, and they must show that their actions are consonant with those principles.
Michael Noble.
I don't think any party or any group of politicians has the right to claim that the moral issues are on one side or another. I believe politics are about the future and what happens to ordinary men and women, and I think this is what the battle is about.
Russell Johnson.
I would agree that politics are about moral issues, and in fact the reason that I'm a Liberal is because I find in the Liberal Party a better basis of principle than I find in the others. Basically, politics is about how we treat other people, and consequently how we use the resources of the country and expend them on education, on development, on welfare, and these basically are moral decisions.
John Gare.
I agree that politics must be regarded on a moral basis. Mind you, one mustn't forget the number of election promises that have been forgotten in recent years where Scotland is concerned. One isn't very struck with the moral aspects of the parties who broke them. But I agree with what Mr. Johnson said in particular, that moral issues must predominate in politics.
James REID.
Well, I believe that moral issues are involved in this election and in politics. The only thing is, everyone here subscribes to that view, but what's their view of morality? I think anything that serves humanity is moral, and I find it impossible to believe that any party or any politician that, for example, supports what the Americans are doing in Vietnam at the present time can't claim to have very high moral standards by my definition of morality. So I believe in morality and principle in politics.
Can I add to supplementary?
Sandy Webster, yes.
Sandy Webster. We don't want to get too deeply into anything here. But what strikes me, and I bet what strikes the viewers, is that all this high-sounding talk about morality, if you come then to the question of where morals begin and end in politicians, we have discovered in recent years that politicians will lay down a line where their morals are public and where their morals are private. I would like to know, and there's only one Tory member has spoken out strongly about this, I would like to know whether this panel thinks that a politician can have a private morality with which the public has nothing to do.
There are two issues now arising. One is the reference to Vietnam, and the second is private and public morality. Michael Noble.
Well, having had the job of Secretary of State, I don't see how any politician who gets to a fairly high level can hope to have a private life. One's life is in public from morning till late the next morning when you go to bed. And to that extent, I think that politicians must behave as people expect them to, or lose support and votes.
Will you, Ross?
Well, I think everyone must take individual responsibility in respect of this. The one thing no government can do is legislate for righteousness and for virtue. This is a self-discipline. All a government can do is sort of create with the legislation a proper atmosphere in which righteousness can flourish. And I think to that extent there is morality in politics. When we come to the question of war itself, no one can surely defend war. But then we've not to take sides on this, Mr. Reid. There's just as much advice being given in relation to what is being done in Vietnam that spurs people on to violence on the other side as well as the one. And there's no black and white in this. And surely the right thing is to get people to accept that nothing can be settled by war, whether it be from the north, the south, from east or from west, and get the people down to settle this thing. There is a United Nations. There are people working for peace, and peace is not necessarily victory for one side or the other.
James Reid.
Well, of course, when you go on to this question of the private morals of the public moral stand of politicians, and I'm not concerned about prying into any politician's private life, but I think the public have a right to demand of people in public life a standard of morality in relation to the social and big issues of the day. And I can't agree with Mr. Ross here about Vietnam. My morality says anything that serves humanity is moral. In the Vietnam, they were cheated of their, if you like, victory in 1954 because the Americans refused to abide by the Geneva Agreement. The morality in Vietnam is to tell the Americans to get out of Vietnam and let the Vietnamese people and the majority of the Vietnamese people decide their future. And I see that any moral stand in Vietnam has got to be in supporting the right of the Vietnamese people to self-determination. And that's why I say I question anybody that claims to have a moral stand when they're supporting what the Americans are doing in Vietnam, napalm, mass saturation bombing, torture, in support of a man called Kai, who's gone on record to say his great hero is Adolf Hitler. I can't accept the morality of a politician that supports that sort of regime in the American actions in Vietnam.
Russell Johnson.
But you are basically accepting that in fact politicians do, as Mr. Ross said, take moral judgments. And inevitably get back to Mr. Webster's question. This means that if they're going to give moral leadership to people, they themselves, politics I think does in the end of the day get back to how you treat the bloke next door. And this is a very much, great deal to do with your attitude on big issues. And if your attitude on small issues is petty and small-minded, your attitude on big issues will be so likewise.
John Gere.
Well, I agree with what Mr. Johnson has just said. I also think there's a rather healthy trend afoot in this election whereby people are pressing candidates much more closely in order to try to get what appear to be honest answers from them. We've had far too much smooth talk from politicians generally for years now, and I hope that this trend to try to pin people down more in public is going to increase. With regard to Vietnam, of course, the issues are exceedingly complicated. No one likes the war, but on the other hand, I must agree with Mr. Ross that we can't settle a war on letting one side win completely.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Can we move on, since we've spent 10 minutes discussing just one question and the supplementary? Douglas Malone, Daily Record.
Since the general election campaign opened, Conservative speakers have claimed credit for any improvement in the Scottish economy during the past 17 months. Can Mr. Noble justify this claim? Can Mr. Ross disprove it? And do the other gentlemen consider there has been enough improvement to justify any quarrel by the two main parties?
Who should get the credit for the improvements in the Scottish economy? The question seems to be pointed, first of all, at least at yourself, Michael Noble.
Well, I think a great deal of the credit, first of all, must go to the industrialists who've decided to expand and create the extra jobs. But it is absolutely clear, and I think Willie Ross made it so on his Checkpoint television not very long ago, that anything which a Secretary of State does in the way of advanced factories cannot bring new jobs for 2 years. Equally, a very tough policy down in the south, which is the other leg of Mr. Ross's claim. The industrialists have got to come to Scotland, they've got to find a site, they've got to build a factory, and you cannot get the jobs again within 18 months or 2 years. So that the immediate answer to the question is that the increase of jobs are due to two things: due to the industrialists who've decided to expand, the measures that we promoted to give them that chance, and I think it is due to the last government and to the industrialists themselves, and nothing whatever to do with the last 500 days.
Willie Ross.
This really is very amusing indeed. You see, we inherited government, and with that we inherited problems. And I think Michael Noble was the last one to deny that there was a certain thing called an adverse balance of payments crises. You see, we had them before. We had them in 57, we had them in 61. The result of which, by government action, Scotland was blotted out along with the rest of the country, and growth really stagnated. This time, we took decisions to hold back in the south and the overstrained areas and to allow Scotland to leap ahead. That one decision alone, and what has happened therefrom, destroys the whole argument of the ex-Secretary of State for Scotland. It was that enabled us to reduce unemployment. Why do people come into Scotland at this particular time? There'll be another announcement made about it indeed today. It's the confidence we've been able to build up. The confidence that was lacking before this time, this recurring crisis and this hitting Scotland when it was most vulnerable, when it seemed to be leaping ahead and dragging it back. That, in short term, plus the confidence in the plans that we have produced for the long term, has given Scotland this new feeling of confidence and leap ahead. Things have been done in Scotland and for Scotland by a British Labour government.
John Gere.
It's interesting to see how the Labour Party is trying to get the best of both worlds here. In 1964, the Scottish emigration rate rose to 40,000 a year, and I noticed recently a Labour Party publication blaming this quite justifiably on the previous government. What they failed to mention so far is that the emigration rate for last year went up further to 45,000
Could I
a
correct
year.
you, Mr. Gere? The emigration statistics are from June to June, and the last one available is 64 to 65.
And we've good reason to believe, Mr. Noble, Mr. Ross, both on the basis of some figures at the back of the white paper and also on the basis of reliable sources, that the figure is 45,000. And this is the first time that I've heard of it being contradicted.
Well, it is quite clear. The Registrar General takes these statistics from June to June.
Well, it'll be very interesting to see what the next official statistics are. We are quite happy with ours. And as far as we're concerned, the pattern appears to have been, well, we're unhappy politically, shall we say, but unhappy from the point of view of Scotland. And it's worth adding the point that these figures do make rather meaningless the recent claims that unemployment has dropped somewhat. It's still far more than twice the United Kingdom level in Scotland. We're not getting anything like the rate of growth we require, and we are quite convinced that the only real solution to this problem is our own government, with control over our taxation, and banking.
James Reid?
Well, I agree with Mr. Ross on one thing. I find it amusing that the Labour and Tory parties are trying to claim credit for the position Scotland's in today. Because it's a fact, as my colleague here from the Scottish Nationalist says, that there's been this tremendous drain from Scotland of manpower in the last 2 years. We'll not argue about the precise details of the figures. And the only way to stop this emigration is by policies that will create real industrial development in Britain, absolute security of employment and higher wages. That's the only way to stop the immigration. And I don't believe it's going to be done on the basis of dangling carrots to the industrialists down south. I believe the only way it will be done is by directing industry to Scotland. If we had our resources socially owned, there would be no difficulty. We would do it by government decree. But that would be socialism, and nobody in this platform, except for myself, subscribe to that sort of policy. But okay, let's direct capitalist-owned resources to Scotland. And don't let anybody talk here about lack of freedom, about direction. 45,000 Scots were directed from their homelands by economic compulsion. I would rather direct resources than direct people, and I say that's the only solution to Scotland's ills, and no other candidate here today or party here today stands for that policy.
Where does the Liberal Party stand?
Well, let's be quite clear about this question of direction. Very few people can successfully direct themselves, far less direct other people. And I don't at all accept that this would be the way to do it. I don't think any of the other members of the panel, with the exception of Mr. Reid, would.
That's right.
Now, I am not prepared.
You're the only alternative.
But that doesn't mean to say it be effective.
I'm not prepared to either to condemn the Labour Party or to give them an accolade on the basis of 17 months. I do really think that the questioner who put the question is fair in saying that this is an extremely short time in which to make any complete judgment on the absolute success or failure of policy in Scotland. What worries me is that it seems to me that the basic statistic that Mr. Gare drew our attention to, that unemployment has been at double the rate of the rest of the United Kingdom and Scotland for far too long. This cannot be overcome until we get a real attempt at regional development. This means, we believe, devolution of government to Scotland, and within Scotland an effective system of regional variation of taxation, something which the recent white paper on incentives didn't really take proper account of, I don't think, in that it made the thing standard all over Scotland. While this was appreciated in many parts of Scotland, I think it still will lead to a concentration in the central belt, which I don't think in the long run will be to advantage of the whole of Scotland.
Michael Noble?
I think that Willie Ross is perfectly right when he says that it is important to keep the confidence of the rest of the world in Scotland, and we've tried to help him in this respect. But I think where he is entirely wrong is to say that anything that he has done has helped industry. We've had £620 million of extra taxation. We've had extra on the petrol. We've had extra now on coal. None of these things can help industry in Scotland. I think the Scottish Council do a splendid job of work. But then if you're going to have tax incentives, as suggested in your last white paper, which take away all the tax incentives to things like tourism, transport, construction industry and so on, of which we have an enormous amount in Scotland, these are actions positively against the development of industry up here.
Any agreement with Willie Ross?
Well, you see, this isn't even factual. We haven't taken away all the tax incentives to tourism.
Have you proposed to?
In actual, we have not even done that. As far as Scotland is concerned, we've suggested that practically the whole of Scotland should be a development area, so that tourism in respect of hotels and the rest of it get the benefit of the Local Employment Act. The Local Employment Act gives grant and loan even to expanding and to new hotels. May I say to Russell Johnson that if he looked at the workings of the Local Employment Act, he will find that there is this grading of inducement within the working of the Local Employment Act. I remember in his area where a job, cost per job, amounted to about £3,000 was permissible, whereas south of the border it's about 1,000. And as you go further north, the Board of Trade has got the power to grade the help given under the Local Employment Act to the remoteness and to the circumstances.
You think it's
as far as Mr. Gere is concerned, and some of the others, they are shutting their eyes to this single fact that 1965 was the best year for attracting new industry into Scotland, and that cannot be denied. Nor can Michael Noble deny that in the House of Commons, after I've been there for 40 days as Secretary of State, he said we had destroyed the confidence of industrialists in Scotland.
We have a lot of questions ahead of us, gentlemen. A two-sentence comment, John Gere.
One, we hear a great deal about the Local Employment Act, but the White Paper makes it quite clear that the total amount of money spent in Scotland in the form of government grants between 1960 and 1965 was only £10.7 million.
Oh, this is
and
not
this is it is in the White Paper, Mr. Ross, the amount spent in grants.
Your second point, Mr. Gere.
The second point is, of course, that we are pretty certain now that we're losing something like £160 million a year of our taxation in the form of money that is spent south of the border or overseas. This money a Scottish government could deploy within Scotland to develop Scottish industry at the rate required.
Two sentences, James Reid.
Well, how can you talk about solving Scotland's problems in the Highlands and Islands? There's about over 8 million acres of land in the Highlands and Islands. Over 7 million of it is owned or controlled by big landowners or companies. Most of them, some of them at any rate, absentee landlords, not using the land economically and so on. And these are some of the underlying basic, what I would even call class issues involved in the Scottish economy. And none of the other parties, apart from the Communist Party, seeks to challenge this position.
Thank you, gentlemen. We've now spent 20 minutes on only two questions. Can I move you on? Margaret Kelly of the Glasgow Observer.
Mr. Chairman, the brain drain and student grants. In 1964, 6,000 teachers, 1,000 doctors and almost 4,000 architects and engineers emigrated from the UK. Now, most of these emigrated within a few years of attaining professional status. Most of them had been in receipt of grants, very big grants. Do you think that people in this section should be allowed to emigrate, and don't you think that they should be compelled, when they do emigrate, to repay part of the grant that they have received?
Should people be allowed to emigrate if they've received grant, and if they are allowed, should they be compelled to repay part of it? John Gere.
This is a problem, of course, that is particularly serious in Scotland, where we've been losing an enormous proportion of our scientific and technological graduates in particular. I would agree that the present situation is very unsatisfactory when many people leave almost as soon as they have become qualified. The whole question, of course, centres in Scotland around the position of the Scottish universities, where we have at the present considerable difficulty for Scottish school leavers getting into many faculties in the Scottish universities, while a large number of places are being taken up by English students who have come north after being unable to get into Oxford or Cambridge. We in the Scottish National Party would not, of course, favour excluding foreign students from the universities at all, but we consider that first priority in Scottish university places must go to the Scottish school leaver. And we consider again that a Scottish government would be able to create the social and economic climate in which most of our graduates would want to stay in Scotland.
And I remind you the question was on repayment of grants.
Yes.
Yes. This is something that I think would be in whole a good idea to a certain extent, but only to a limited extent.
Thank you. Russell Johnson.
First of all, I don't think that you get over the problem by a negative approach of this sort. I mean, you must ask yourself, why do they go away? And it's not going to stop them going away if they have to repay. I would admit that it might be a reasonable thing to ask of Scottish students that they would give a set period, as for example under the scheme for reattracting teachers, which your government, Michael Noble, introduced, whereby those in receipt of the grant must give to teaching at least, I think, 2 years. And one could put a limitation of this sort on, but the root of the problem is, why do they go away? And this relates to teachers' conditions. We think that there must eventually be a Royal Commission on teacher salaries and pay, and it relates to opportunities in industry and science, and that end is more important than the first.
James Reid.
Well, I don't think the solution is to erect legal barriers to such people, for example, emigrating. The problem that makes many of them emigrate is, first of all, for many of these people and people in these professions, their wages are a disgrace. It's the first thing. And secondly, of course, with many scientists, there's a sense of frustration because in research work and so on, they're restricted by the lack of funds made available to them. And they can go elsewhere to America and so on and get much better facilities for their research and scientific study and so on. And we could have the funds and the money available and the facilities available in this country to meet this problem, to meet their needs, if only we were spending our money wisely instead of £2,172 million a year in armaments and all the rest of it. Some of that cash allocated for the development of science-based industries and research and so on, plus higher wages for the professions, for the people, teachers and so on. And I think that's how to tackle this problem, not by legal statute or
I wonder very much, Willie Ross, repayment of grants.
I was going to ask Mr. Reid if all this brain drain was to the Soviet Russia, but I gather it's not. It's to other
Why
capitalist
ask me
countries.
about Soviet Russia?
No.
I'm a Scot.
So am I.
Yes.
Very much a Scot. And I think you were right.
Not any more than me.
If we concentrate on what we want in Scotland. Now, surely, at this stage, Scotland does not want to be parochial and have universities that are not, that deny the name university. In other words, that we limit the intake and we don't want people from abroad or from south of the border.
I didn't say that, Mr. Ross.
No, but I'm just saying this. And from there we go on to the question of why do they go. Now, I think one of the things we prided ourselves in Scotland is that we have provided men who've pioneered in different parts of the world and enriched life elsewhere. In the East, in Africa and the rest. We want this to continue. We don't want to tie our people down to work only in Scotland, but we want sufficient of them to remain in Scotland and not to have their emigration economically determined. So this means having the growth in Scotland, the renewal of our social fabric that will use our own architects, quantity surveyors, our own scientists and the rest. And this means pressing on and on with the rebuilding of Scotland and the industrial regeneration of Scotland. This is what we've started on. But let's not think of it in terms of narrowness and of restricting people. Let's attract people to Scotland and let's make careers for our young people within Scotland.
Thank you. Michael Noble?
Well, I agree that I think it's a mistaken view to try and get people to repay what they have already been given. But I would say this, that the brain drain has mainly hit us in the doctoring profession, and I think there it isn't only the pay, it's the conditions of the doctors that drives them away. And I think that bringing back prescription charges, which will give us some more money to give them the right sort of conditions, is the proper policy. On scientists, science tends to be a universal business, and therefore scientists should be allowed to move. I would like to see far more trained engineers in Scotland helping to develop our industries. And as for teachers, Russell Johnson referred to the 2-year bar. Looking quickly round me on the panel, it ought to have been much longer.
John Gare?
The question of teachers, I think, raises the question of teachers' salaries. And I don't know how on earth the present Secretary of State could have turned down the last Scottish Joint Council settlement after months of negotiation. I think what annoyed many teachers wasn't perhaps so much the money as the principle involved. With regard to research, we know that we do not get anything like our proportional share of government research in Scotland. That's one reason for the brain drain from Scotland. We also know that we only get a quarter of our defence jobs, our population share of defence jobs in Scotland, and that's another reason for the brain drain from Scotland. And I can't see how present plans are going to solve either of these things.
A brief comment?
Oh, I'd love to comment on every single one of these. But when I heard Mr. Gare talking about the months of negotiation, for instance, in relation to teacher salaries, of course you'll appreciate that the Secretary of State had nothing to do with that negotiation. And it was only after that part of the negotiation was finished it comes to the Secretary of State. And I hope he doesn't suggest that the Secretary of State must not take into account the wider interests of Scotland in relation to this, and ask that the Secretary of State merely be
I don't think
no, just a minute now. Must merely be a rubber stamp. We've argued this one before. We'll continue to argue with it. This thing is not finished. It's the prices then comes aboard at the moment.
I think, gentlemen, when we're all about to speak, we might move on, since there is a silence from the panel, and ask for the next question from Alistair Syme, please, Daily Record.
The Labour Party has said that the most urgent area for tax reform is the rating system, and other speakers from other parties have said much the same thing. Many Scots see themselves faced with economic hardship because of the new re-evaluations which are coming out this year. How urgent is the need for reform, and what form should it take?
How urgent is the need for rating reform, and what form should it take? What's the Liberal view on this?
Well, we have said for a very long time this is an extremely urgent matter. We have said that the existing rating system, based as it is on arbitraries like the size of a house, should be replaced, where possible, by a system of the taxing of the value of the site. There have been surveys done on this which showed that the resultant income, and I think it's accepted by pretty well everybody, that while it's not really right that a tax should be based on house size, you ought to pay something for the kind of site and the position of site you occupy, because land is of value. There ought to be a return from the individual for that, and that a switchover from the rating system to tax and land values would be a step in the right direction, and one could link this with, for example, removing from the responsibility of local authorities education costs, most of police costs, and making a switch of emphasis in this direction.
Michael Noble?
I think it's urgent to the extent that the rates have been going up even faster recently than before, and it is inevitably so in a community where the younger people, often the unmarried people, have the greatest amount of money and the least amount of responsibility, that something should be done to redress the balance. And I believe that while the main problems are being fought out, our policy of taking 100 million off the rates and putting them onto tax is the quickest and most effective way of starting to redress that balance.
John Guerra?
We're in favour of transferring education, roads, water and police costs from rates onto central funds. This, of course, in a sense would be an expedient, and obviously it would require a lot more money from central funds, but at least it would remove the present highly inequitable system, which has, because of the tremendous rise in rates in recent years, has borne more and more heavily upon many people who can no longer afford to meet the rates bills. It also, the high rates level acts as a very severe disincentive to industry. There are other proposals, of course. In the long term, something like local income tax might conceivably be the answer to the question, but it's a very, very complicated one. But certainly in the short term, transfer these charges to central funds.
James Reid?
Well, rates is a form of taxation, and nationally we at any rate give a semblance of basing our taxation on incomes. And I don't see why that principle shouldn't apply to the taxation called rates. It should be like a local income tax. But in the past period in Scotland, the reverse has been the case. Industrialists, as a matter of fact, go into industrial derating were excused 50% of their rates. And I'm in favour, my party, the Communist Party, is in favour of rates being a form of income tax, based on income. But then the other point about rates, no matter what the system is, will continue to go up until we get a government in this country that has policies that make available money for the building of schools and other social amenities at a nominal interest rate, because our taxes, our rates are going up in order that local authorities can meet this crippling burden of interest payments. And if we ever want to control rates and keep them down and reduce them, this problem's got to be tackled.
Willie Roth?
Well, I think there are two problems here. First of all is the burden of rates, and the second one is how you meet that burden, how you share it out. Well, the burden of rates has been rising for quite a long time because the pressure on services, better schools, better educational facilities, health, local health service, the rest of it, leads to increased expenditure. From 1950 to 51, I think the rate-borne expenditure was 32 millions. By 62, 63, this had risen to 103 millions. And then you come to how it's shared out. If you have an inequitable system of rating, obviously, the higher the burden, the greater the injustice. That, I agree with Mr. Reid here. The fact that it is completely isolated from ability to pay does lead to injustice. Now, what have we done? First of all, we've increased the grants from the government to local authorities. Secondly, we have just passed a rating relief bill that will relieve in Scotland about 300,000 people who are above the national assistance level. They're looked after through the grant they get in relation to their weekly allowances. But people above that, single people up to about £8 a week, couples up to about £10 a week will be able to get relief of 2/3 over £7.10 of their burden. That, plus our latest proposal of a transfer of about, in Scotland it will amount to about 3 million, your 100 millions of course refer to the whole of Great Britain. 3 million the first year, 6 million the second year, 9 million the third year, and so on, of expenditure over to central government, and limiting that relief, the greater part of that relief, to the domestic ratepayer will itself help to slow down this rise in the burden. But I entirely agree with some of my colleagues here who have said that, of course, we've got to look for more radical solutions in the long run. But we can't ignore the present problem, and this is how we've approached it.
Michael Noble?
I think it is fair just to say this, that though you have increased the grants to local authorities, you've only increased them as long as the present bank rate remains at its present level, and if it were to drop, they would in fact be getting less than they were getting before.
No, we relate our help to the circumstances. We're not like the Tories who
You've written them into a bill.
The bill isn't finished yet, and if you have any complaints, same as I offered you with the Highland Development Bill, if you want to leave Argyll out of it, then good enough, I'll consider it.
Can I move you on, gentlemen? The point when you're all looking mutually indignant is always, I think, a good breaking point. And ask the next question from Eric Montford of the Daily Mail.
What are the main questions which you've been getting at your election meetings, particularly from young people? Have you discovered what it is that the young voter, the younger generation of voters in Scotland wants from a government?
What does the younger generation of voters want from a government? This is a fundamental question, is it not, for the next generation or two? James Reid.
Well, my experience at meetings with the young people, it's been, I don't think I could consider this surprising, but I think it's very significant. We were on to this earlier. They are raising moral issues. There's a lot of talk in the press just now about violence of youth. And it seems to me that the problem in Britain is not juvenile delinquency, but adult delinquency. And the thing that's been coming up from young people, to me at any rate, have been Vietnam. They have abhorred this war. They're against what's happening in Rhodesia. By that I mean by Ian Smith and the racialist policies there. There is the question of Scottish government coming up from young people, and I agree with this. We should have a Scottish government. Incidentally, Mr. Gere, of course, I'm also for a Vietnamese government, not only Home Rule for Scotland, but for the people of Vietnam.
You're not speaking for the Scottish National Party, though?
I'm speaking for the Communist Party, and we're for Home Rule for Scotland. And this has come up. There's a lot of young Scots, I think, desirous of having a Scottish Parliament, and I think they're quite right. The only difference that I've got with the Nationalists, I want a Scottish Socialist Parliament, not any sort of Scottish Parliament. But that's certainly come up from young people in the election.
Thank you. Michael Noble?
I think in the areas that I've been talking about, the young people are mostly interested in rather different problems to the ones that have been talked about so far. They're very much interested in the problem of inflation, because there, as I said earlier on, a lot of the young people are getting a good deal of money. Their life is very much more expensive. Because they motor a good deal, they're very much interested in cost of transport and petrol. And I think above all, they're interested in the possibility of getting worthwhile jobs in the outlying areas of the country. And they want to see progressive and sensible policies brought about so that they can stay at home and get a worthwhile job.
Russell Johnson?
Well, firstly, So I would agree with certain of the things Michael Noble mentioned. Question of worthwhile jobs in the area from which they come, yes, they have been interested in that, and I'm afraid Michael Noble's government did not have an awfully good record in this respect.
4,000 new jobs in the Highlands.
15,000 flow out from the Highlands, I think, is the important thing. Democratic participation, they are interested in that. They're tired of being told what to do by people. And I find it rather odd for Mr. REID to be sitting there talking about democratic participation, when in fact, if this was a communist state, none of the four of us would be here at all.
Nonsense.
We wouldn't be allowed to express our point of view.
Nonsense.
And this is something we
the
mustn't
last
forget.
general election.
This is what we mustn't forget. They are
The British road to socialism.
Russell Johnson, you still have the floor, believe it or not.
Thank you. They are interested in Rhodesia, certainly. They are interested in the whole question of crime and punishment, because the rise in the crime rate is worrying people, and methods of settling it are also worrying people. I think most would recognize the question is not a tough or a soft treatment, but an effective way of curbing and containing crime, and that this in turn and naturally is related to the way of life we have in the country.
John Garrett.
The young people in our district are exceedingly interested in the question of a Scottish Parliament, as Mr. Reid suggested. So much so, in fact, that at one of the schools in the recent mock election, the SNP candidate easily topped the poll. They are interested in getting jobs, good opportunities, reasonably close to their families. They are interested in crime and punishment. They are quite interested in various other questions, but we found a tremendous amount of interest on this particular question, the feeling that they want to be able to play their part in their own country with their own government.
Willie Roth.
Yes, I would agree with most of the speakers so far. Young people see probably more clearly and simply some of the issues. They don't always see the difficulties. They don't always see the solution, and they're probing after it. I've been fascinated by discussions I've had with them on this question of crime and punishment. They're more interested in new aspects of penology rather than the older person tends to think of a return to the birch and in terms of a punishment rather than deterrence. The young people are more deeply interested. They're interested in the question of jobs. They're interested in the question of housing. Probably people who are a little bit older, the young married people, they're interested in the question of housing. And I think we've underrated the effect of the scarcity of housing upon young people and their determination to leave Scotland. I think it's not always the job that's the determining factor. It's the fact they've got to wait 3, 4, 5, in some cases 7 or 8 years in the larger areas before they can possibly get a house.
Thank you very much. Can I ask for the last question from James Munro of the Glasgow Herald?
Well, can we switch from the young people to an old industry? I'd like to say the Geddes report recommends that the steel companies cut prices to the shipbuilding industry. Do you agree with this? And if it is done and the steel is nationalized, who pays for the cuts?
Can I ask you to reply to this in one single sentence? It was, after all, a question, do you agree or do you not? And we have only time for your verdicts, gentlemen. John Gare.
We consider that the steel industry in Scotland could cut its prices were Scotland to be given competitive fuel prices, which Scotland has not been getting for years.
James Reid.
I believe that steel should be nationalised, and that the steel industry in Britain is perfectly capable of providing steel at an economic price for shipbuilding.
Russell Johnson.
Yes, I agree that this has got to be done.
Willie Roth.
Nationalisation of steel?
No.
Willie Roth.
The Geddes report points out that 2/3 of the cost of a ship is incurred outside the yards altogether. Steel plays a big part in this, and with an efficiently organised, public-controlled, publicly owned steel industry, we can achieve these cuts and get the differential that the Geddes Committee
Thank you very much.
says is
Michael
essential.
Noble in the
I
Senate.
entirely agree that something should be done to keep the price of steel down. It will be much cheaper to the taxpayer if steel is not nationalized.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. That is the end of this third program, trial, as it were, by television. Thank you, journalists. Thank you, press. And from Glasgow, good night.